Hi, I'm going to go over the midterm exam right now, and the midterm exam is going to be administered next week on Tuesday on November 5th on Blackboard. And this exam that you'll take on Blackboard is going to be up from 6 a.m. in the morning for those people who get up very early, and it's going to be up on Blackboard until 12 midnight. So that means that you don't want to wait until 12 midnight because that's when it's going to be over. So you want to get on Blackboard sometime, I would think, before 11 o'clock. And once you log on, so you're going to go on to Blackboard to the midterm tab. And once you get onto that midterm tab, and once you begin, once you say start, you're ready to start the exam, you'll have an hour and 15 minutes. So you're going to have 25 multiple choice questions, and I'm also going to give you, mixed in with the whole 25 questions, 3 more questions. So you'll have a total of 28, but the highest grade you're going to get is 25 out of 25. So that means you have a chance to get 3 questions wrong and still get a perfect 25 out of 25. And the midterm itself is going to be worth 30 points. So you have one other component, and this is a component that you hand in separately. So in addition to doing the multiple choice, you're going to have an essay question, and you're going to select one of the essay questions that you did in the past and that you've improved upon, you perfected it, you feel comfortable, and you're going to hand that in, and that's going to be handed in separately on a separate tab under a separate place under the midterm tab, which will allow you to submit your homework assignment. Okay, so you're going to have everything under midterm tab, but you do that after you finish the exam, before you start it. That's a separate process. And so, give me your best question, as I mentioned before in that preview video that I did before this, just giving you some overall strategies of how to do the midterm, how to prepare for it. So just to go over really briefly, as I said, you want to look at the essay questions. You want to be sure you understand the essay questions. You want to also be sure that you have the major points from the articles. So some of you may need to go back and outline, reread some of the articles. Again, think of it for what are the major points? What do I need to know about? What is they're difficult articles, but what was the main point that Parsons was making? For the article on bureaucracy and Max Weber, what are the key things I need to know about authority and types of authority and how they differ? What are their characteristics? So just kind of be familiar with that. And again, you should have written about that in your essay, so that should be a good way to help you prepare. You can look at PowerPoints, you can listen to videos. So I think you probably have, and you can read other things in addition, of course. So it's always possible you can find lots of things online about any of these theorists that we've been looking at, and you can look at encyclopedias, you can look at other articles, information. You'll find some more guidance, further readings if you want. But in general, you just need to get these key points and look at the notes and the PowerPoint that you have for each subject under your lectures tab. Okay. So you'll have an hour and 15 minutes from the time you begin, and you'll get up to 25 out of 25, but you could get up to 3 questions, the additional questions. So do every question. It's not that you leave out 3. You do every 28, and I'll grade you. We'll deal with the people who get 28 out of 28 separately. Maybe you'll get a little extra credit. But for now, let's just say the top grade is 25 out of 25. If you can get them all right, you'll maybe get a little bonus for Halloween. We're just one day after Halloween, so you'll get a special treat if you get 28 questions. Okay, so let's look over some of the structure and look over some of the questions that you could have. And I'm going to write some new questions, and maybe some of the ones we go over, or in some variation. Be careful, because sometimes something could be almost the same, but it could change a little bit. But let me give you some ideas about the structure. So you're going to have 1 or 2 questions definitely on the film, human resources. And I've put notes up on Blackboard. I've also, for those who are in the online course, remember we saw part of it in the regular class that meets. And I also told you in the library on the 3rd floor, you can watch human resources if you want to in the library. You just ask the librarian and they'll give it to you at the media desk. Also, remember on Netflix, you can rent it as rent it from Netflix. And then there was a version in Spanish for those of you who speak Spanish with in French with Spanish subtitles. Somebody told me that he watched it and the translation was very good. But other than that, you know, you have to get a hold of it. Okay, so there'll maybe be one or two questions. There'll be definitely one and maybe two questions about something about the film. So I'm not sure I'll spend too much time on that because, okay, I'll give you. I guess I could read one of the questions from Human Resources. They're so long, but okay, let's do that. Okay, so which of the following is not a way that hierarchy was illustrated in the film Human Resources? Okay, so, okay. Frank's supervisor resents him making a suggestion to the CEO regarding the survey. He clearly expresses his anger to Frank, saying that hierarchy must be respected. Okay, so was that, which of the following is not a way that hierarchy was illustrated? So maybe I'll go over them point by point. So Frank's supervisor does resent him making a suggestion going over his head. So this was an interesting point in the film where we kind of learn, if we don't know that already, that in corporate situations, generally, if you do that, if you don't let your boss, let's say, take credit and possibly give you some credit, if he or she is so kind, if you don't kind of follow that sort of hierarchical, power structure, benefit structure, then you can be in trouble. And Frank is at least told that was not correct, and that from now on he has to speak to the person directly, he's directly responsible to, and not go over his head. So, next question. So that one is definitely true. So that's not one of them that we would select. The next one. When Frank is hired, he fires his best friend, realizing that he cannot be a boss to someone who does not see him as an authority figure. Okay, so I'll just tell you, that one is not true, right? Frank doesn't fire his best friend. He doesn't have that. He's an intern in HR, and he doesn't have the right to fire or to do anything of that nature. That comes from somebody at a higher level. Okay, let's just read the ones that are true, because that's important to know. So when the big bosses from the head office, this is, I think, toward the middle, or actually more toward the end of the film, when the big bosses from the head office come, I think that's how they were referred to, that's why I use that term, come to visit, the CEO takes credit for the survey that Frank had devised, remember, on the merits of the 35-hour work week. He doesn't let Frank come in, and he slams the door in his face. So you probably, if you've seen it, you remember that scene where, Frank is starting to feel like, okay, he's getting a lot of respect, people like him, he feels he has a certain degree of authority that he's claimed, and he's also concerned about some issue that he wants to talk about. So he just rushes to go into the office thinking that he's kind of feels like he's one of them. But the CEO does not let him come in and closes the door in his face. So in other words, saying like, your entry into this room is predicated on whether or not I decide you deserve to enter. So this is, something, again, very common in organizations, that there might be an event, if you're a new person and you're in a lower status, you're not included in, of course, you're not included in some meetings. You're included in some, but maybe not all meetings, and certainly not at the higher level. And so there's that kind of hierarchy of who gets included, who gets excluded. And we can see that when the door is slammed in his face, that's a kind of exercise of authority. When Max Weber talked about the idea of legitimate authority, right? So if you don't have legitimate authority, you cannot close the door in someone's face, right? It wouldn't be appropriate if you are an intern to close the door in a person who's a permanent employee's face, or a supervisor's face as he or she tries to walk in. So there's a kind of decorum that has to be followed in organizations. Okay, the last question, which is also correct, and is then not the choice, because you had to choose which one was not representative of how hierarchy was illustrated. Okay, the executives, including Frank, observed the men and women working on the factory floor. They walk through, stop and look, and ask questions whenever they wish. Employees do not have the right to do this with executives. So I think, again, it's something very basic, but something important to think about, because it reveals how, when Parsons or Max Weber talk about bureaucracies, we're looking at it more abstractly, and when we see it in the film, we see it in practice, or when you read about it, or when you experience it. So that idea that the executives have the right to stop and to shake hands, or not shake hands, or ask somebody to come to their office to speak to them about something, but employees do not have this right. Employees on the factory floor can't go to the corporate office, or can't go to the human resources office, right, and start to observe human resources people at work and say, well, we're conducting a survey, or we're conducting our own kind of observation of what kind of system exists within human resources. That's not allowed. So again, it happens in a way that's very hierarchical. People with more power have control, have authority, have rights to do things that people with less power never would even think of doing in an organization. Okay, so let me give you an example of a question from Talcott Parsons. I think in the class that met when I gave a little bit of a review for the midterm, we looked at this question, but let me read this for others if we need more of a review, and I'll explain why each one is correct or not correct. So Talcott Parsons, in his suggestion for a sociological approach to the theory of organizations, says that organizations are, okay, now which one is true? Organizations are very much like sporting events. Organizations are subsystems within the social structure. Organizations are C, systems that operate on the basis of mechanical authority. On the basis of mechanical solidarity. So mechanical solidarity has to do with when you have prescribed, for example, in a traditional society, you have hierarchies, you have, in a traditional system, let's say you have the father, the elder brother have a certain level of power. People in other statuses may not have as much right to express their points of view or to make decisions within the family. So that's an example of mechanical. It's based on the status that you occupy. Whereas in an organic kind of solidarity, you have a situation where people are interdependent. So here at Brooklyn College, for example, we have faculty members who might collaborate or interact with each other. We have advisors that help support the kinds of things that faculty do and that help students. We have deans and provosts and registrar's office that provides a certain kind of function. It's a very interdependent system where every part contributes in an important way. So that would be an example of something that's organic, that there is a kind of relationship that goes on that's not just formal, but that has many interdependent kind of components to it. So, but that one is not the one that he stresses so much in his article. Okay, so he may have mentioned mechanical solidarity possibly, but it's not something that, and it's not. Okay, let me read the question again. Talcott Parsons, in his suggestion for a sociological approach to the theory of organization, says that organizations are C, systems that operate on the basis of mechanical solidarity. No, that wouldn't be correct. It's or D, organizations are obsolete. The key word that that you kind of should go to is letter B, subsystems. So he says that organizations are subsystems within the social structure. So he's looking at society as the big system, and all those other components are all the different kinds of organizations and all the other types of structures that exist within the society. Okay, so let me now go on to, so you'll have a couple of questions. I think you'll have about maybe 3 questions, even 4 questions that might deal with Parsons. So that's important to kind of get his major ideas, understand about when he talks about hierarchy and goals and all the important things that organizations have to have, right? Every organization has to have a goal. Every organization has to produce something. And again, understand that metaphor of organizations as almost as human beings, as bodies with the different functions contributing to the organism's everyday life. Okay, so now going on to Max Weber and the concept of bureaucracy. So let me read you a question from the Max Weber section. Okay, there are 3 types of authority that an organization and its leadership can have. So remember how he talks about the idea of traditional charismatic and also bureaucratic authority. So it can relate to the leader, right? You can be a person, an individual who's charismatic, an individual who's traditional, an individual who's bureaucratic, and your authority can be based on those your people's acceptance of you being a legitimate leader can have roots in tradition, right? Can have roots in, for example, the fact that you're in a certain caste allows you and gives you the right in the minds of the individuals in that society to interact and to take certain kinds of actions and to do certain kinds of things, which somebody in another caste has no right and is not authorized to do. So let me read this again. So there are 3 types of authority that an organization and its leadership can have. Okay, I'm going to read you now the questions as you can choose them. Arbitrary, scientific, personal. Traditional, scientific, bureaucratic. Sacred, scientific, corporate. And then the last one, which I already gave away, but that you should know, traditional, charismatic, bureaucratic. Those are the 3 types of authority. So know those 3 types, and also know, I could ask a question particularly about charismatic authority or particularly about bureaucratic, and what kind of functions or what kind of features each of those has. So be sure you understand that. Understand which are more stable, which kinds of authority are more transitory, right? So the charismatic authority has really to do with the personality characteristics of an individual. Charismatic authority. And so if an organization is run on charismatic authority, or a leader exercises charismatic authority, it's not going to be the same it's going to be a different type of organization. So most likely what you would have, if you have a charismatic leader running an organization, you would have something, most likely if it's a large, depending on the size, once it starts to become an organization, which is what's interesting about the charisma that we've talked about, once it starts to become an organization, it has to have some predictability and some structures that are set and continue to operate in the same way. But an example, I guess you could think of charisma as something that in some ways is pre-organizational, right? Again, the leader, the person, the prophet, the hero, an individual who captivates a large group of people. It could be politically, it could be religiously, it could be in some kind of social movement. So a person who is able to influence a group to do something and then to become an organization. But it's a very, as I was trying to say, very unstable kind of organization because it depends on the continued participation and inspiration of that individual. So once the individual loses that or starts to not have the same kind of acceptance and inspiration in the eyes of the followers, that person then can very quickly, automatically cease to be charismatic. So that's why it's unstable. And so if you're talking about, you could very well be studying an organization or be working in an organization which is very bureaucratic and it could be a bank. And you might have a leader, you might have a CEO of that organization who's extremely charismatic, who people really identify with and people are inspired by. It's less likely in certain kinds of industries than it is in other types of industries. But let's say it's possible that you could have that in the bank. But what's most likely then is we're going to have a mix. We're going to have a charismatic leader, but we're going to have other leaders who might be operating on legal rational, who certainly are, because in banking it's a regulated kind of system and it's necessary that you have these very predictable practices in place. So you could have organizations that mix tradition, right? You could have a very large, let's say, department store, chain of stores run by a family or run by a particular individual, and that individual can be very traditional in his or her leadership, putting their sons in very high positions, rewarding people who are accepted or close in the family, or even people that person sort of deems to be very much like him or her. So it could be ethnicity, it could be race, it could be that the person decides that people who live in a certain community in Brooklyn where he comes from are the kinds of people that he wants to put ahead. So that would be an example of a traditional kind of leader in an organization that is running largely on bureaucratic principles. So that's interesting to think of. But understand in their pure forms first before we talk about mixing things. What is a purely traditional lead or purely charismatic, purely bureaucratic? And understand the characteristics of bureaucracy. What are the characteristics? What are some of the things that have to be present for an organization to be bureaucratic? And remember that idea of ideal types, that no organization is going to conform perfectly to the kinds of traits that Max Weber said you'll find in a bureaucratic organization, but it's going to have some version of that in order for it to function in that kind of a way. So let's go on.